Welcome to the panel on discrimination in the dating and consumer markets. This is room 3037. My name is Professor Darrell Miller. I teach civil procedure and civil rights litigation here at Duke University Law School. I've got a great panel of colleagues and former colleagues and new friends as well, and I'm really excited to be here. So I think we're going to go in reverse order. The first speaker is going to be Professor Sandra Sperino, who teaches in the area of civil procedure, torts, and employment law. She was the chair of the AALS section on the employment discrimination law and contributing editor to several employment law books published by the ABA. She's going to speak to us on how the courts skew discrimination law against workers. This is a co-authored project with another one of my former colleagues, Suja Thomas. After Sandra, we're going to go to my current colleagues, Professor Kate Bartlett and Professor Mitu Gulati. Kate is the former dean of this school, and Mitu, well, Mitu's sui generis. Now he's a professor where he teaches contracts. They're going to speak on discrimination by customers. Our next speaker after that will be Michael Selmi, who is at the Samuel Taylor Research Professor at George Washington School of Law. Writes in the areas of employment discrimination, employment law, and constitutional law. He's going to speak on statistical disparities and intentional discrimination, defining the contemporary discrimination. And we have perhaps one additional speaker, Rick Banks at Stanford, who might be able to show up, but we'll see. Yeah, if not, you can take a step. What's that? He is here in town. He is here in town? And there he is. There he goes. That's right. So with that, Sandra?
Oh, is already a chair there? So thank you, Darrell. This conference has been terrific, and especially getting to see one of my former colleagues again, such a wonderful treat. So I have to start by saying that I feel a little bit guilty. And the reason that I feel guilty is that this conference is about the future of social movements. And my paper, unfortunately, is going to talk about the past and the present. And so I hope at the end to tie it back to the theme of the conference, which is the future. So Darrell told me that we have about 10 minutes. And so what I'm going to try to do in these 10 minutes is to summarize a forthcoming book that will be published next year by Oxford University Press. Now, one of the nice things about it being a forthcoming book is that if any of you have comments or suggestions on how to improve it, we're very much in the editing process now. What this book does is both a kind of a depressing project and at the same time, I think, a hopeful project. And so the reason that it's a depressing project is that it focuses on first-generation discrimination claims. And what I mean by first-generation discrimination claims is an employment discrimination case where the plaintiff or the worker has evidence that race, sex, or other protected traits were explicitly taken into account in making employment decisions. And so I'm going to refer to these as either first generation or traditional discrimination claims. Now, this conference has been really enriching, and as you've noticed, we have not focused at all today on first generation discrimination. The theory has become much more rich. We're now focused on structural discrimination, intersectionality, unconscious discrimination, and these are all important new phases in the fight for social justice. However, I'm going to argue that the work of first-generation discrimination, or at least fighting it, is not over yet. And the way that I hope to do that is the same way that our book tries to do that, by using a narrative storytelling. And so what I'm going to do today is to show you, and I only have 10 minutes, so it's necessarily going to be an abbreviated version, show you how some court cases are coming out today. And in doing so, my presentation today and the book as a larger project hopes to take an educated lay reader, not necessarily a lawyer, into the minds of federal judges and how they tend to view discrimination cases. So the central premise of the book is that the structure that's built up, the analytical structure to analyze discrimination cases, doesn't do it very well. In fact, it takes traditional discrimination cases, again, those with intentional evidence of intentional bias, and ends up dismissing many of those cases. So cases where you or I might look at the facts and at least think that the facts suggest discrimination, courts will use a variety of frameworks to dismiss even intentional discrimination cases, and they do this by granting summary judgment. And the way that the courts do this is through a series of complicated frameworks and doctrines that have developed over the past 40 or so years. And again, I don't have time to discuss all of them today, but I'm just going to mention a few. One doctrine dismisses discrimination claims because the courts say that what happened to workers is not serious enough to count as discrimination. And I have a couple of examples. I think I see some students here, so this is great. And I'll just let you be the judge of whether you think these facts are serious enough to establish discrimination. We have the stray remarks doctrine. This is where the court says that particular evidence of discrimination is too far removed for some reason and therefore can be excluded for purposes of summary judgment. It doesn't count as evidence, and therefore the courts can grant summary judgment in the employer's favor. We've also seen fairly recently a really robust restriction on causation doctrine. We won't have time to get into that today, but this is actually one of the major restrictions that's being placed on discrimination law. And then sort of my favorite, or the topic of much of my scholarly research, is the frameworks that the courts use. So all of you are probably pretty familiar with this famous quote from Justice Roberts and parents involved. The way to stop discrimination on the basis of race is to stop discriminating on the basis of race. Well, our book shows that there's actually another way to stop discrimination. And so how the courts can do this is to just declare a wide swath of conduct as not counting as discrimination. And so let me tell you the story of a couple of cases, and you can make your own decision. Again, these are based on real cases. I have changed the names of the workers. So this is Ron's story. The case that he brought to court presented the following evidence. So coworkers routinely displayed Confederate flags on work boxes and hats. The letters KKK were scrawled throughout the workplace. Supervisors repeatedly called him boy and used other racial epithets, and you see the other quotes that are on the board. Now, I won't show a show of hands, but just kind of, do you think this sounds like discrimination? Okay, to me, this isn't a difficult case, and it should be even less difficult for federal judges. Now, if you remember at summary judgment, the judge's job is not to determine whether discrimination happened or not, but rather to determine whether there is a disputed fact such that the case should go to the jury. For a federal judge, this was an easy case to dismiss based on summary judgment, and the rationale goes something like this. Ron's story does not present facts that are severe or pervasive enough to constitute racial harassment as a matter of law. So this doesn't just happen in the racial context. This is Helen's story. So she is a police officer, and a male officer engaged in the following conduct. He tried to kiss her on multiple occasions, stood on tiptoe to look down her shirt, rubbed up against her, showed up in her driveway multiple times. One time he was drunk, told her son that he loved her, and said numerous things that I can't repeat here, but that are listed on page 33 in the draft of our book, just really terrible things. And so a judge found this to also be a very easy case. This case must be dismissed on summary judgment, and the reason why this is not severe or pervasive conduct and doesn't count as federal employment discrimination. The D.C. Circuit has gone even farther. This is a recent hypothetical from a D.C. Circuit case. The D.C. Circuit asks us to imagine the following set of facts. So a black employee gets accidentally copied on a secret memo from her boss. And in the secret memo, the boss says, I don't want to give evaluations to African American workers. The worker who is black gets a bad evaluation, and then she sues about the negative evaluation. The D.C. Circuit said uncategorically, summary judgment would have to be granted in this case. The reason why: a negative evaluation does not count as employment discrimination under federal law. So there is a series of doctrines that tell workers that what happened to them doesn't count. It's not serious enough to be discrimination. We add on top of that the stray remarks doctrine. Again, remember, this is a doctrine that allows a court to say that a comment is too far removed from discrimination to count as evidence. And so one very depressing part of my summer was I sort of went through stray remarks cases to see what courts were calling stray remarks. Supervisors repeatedly using racial epithets to the worker who is suing are counted as stray remarks by some courts. Referring to female workers using words like bitch, slut, and whore. This was in the same case. All of these epithets were used by the same individual against the same woman. Those comments are stray remarks. They don't count for purposes of her case. A supervisor saying that black workers are lazy, worthless, and just here to get paid. Or even in the age discrimination context, a worker being told by a supervisor that you're just too old for this kind of work several weeks before the employee is terminated. That is a stray remark. Now, this is a very powerful doctrine. What it allows a judge to do is to declare that that evidence does not count for purposes of summary judgment. Therefore, there are no disputed facts showing discrimination, and the case can be dismissed. Now, I don't have time to get into the vagaries of causation doctrine, but many of you may be familiar that in the age context and in the retaliation context, the Supreme Court has recently ruled that workers are required to establish but-for causation. What has resulted is an odd series of cases, some of them coming out of the 11th Circuit, where if you allege both age and retaliation, both claims must be dismissed. Why? Because neither can be the but-for cause of the alleged action. And we even have judges dismissing those cases at the pleading stage, which is actually counter to the rules of civil procedure. But nonetheless, we see courts using the not serious enough, the stray remarks doctrine, and causation together. On top of that, the courts have developed this series of really complicated frameworks. And so I don't know if I have any students in here who are taking employment discrimination. So you take the class, and what you learn are a series of frameworks. You learn about single motive discrimination. You learn about McDonnell-Douglas. You learn about direct evidence, mixed motive cases, the harassment framework, the retaliation framework. All of these complicated frameworks and their accompanying doctrines. And what this results in is a kind of name it and frame it mentality. So the courts look for a certain set of facts, they find the right framework to run those facts through, and then they do the analysis. And then whatever pops out at the end tells us our answer, whether discrimination happened or not. But unfortunately, if we look at all of these complex rules and frameworks, there are tons of problems with them. First, they're individually complicated. If anyone's familiar with McDonnell-Douglas, it's kind of a sui generis thing that we've never seen in law before. It works differently than everything else. And if we funnel a case through McDonnell-Douglas, it doesn't necessarily tell us whether discrimination happened, which is problematic. Few cases, if any, have told us how all these frameworks fit together. And so the lower courts are really having to do the difficult work to understand how causation, the frameworks, the stray remarks doctrine, the not serious doctrines work together. And it's very difficult because, remember, each of the doctrines independently is individually complicated. The frameworks themselves are very technical and arcane. They tend to focus the lawyers and the courts also on these very picky details that only lawyers care about. And they encourage courts to really think about discrimination in this kind of rote sorting process. So in other words, a judge picks up McDonnell-Douglas, runs the facts of the case through McDonnell-Douglas. What comes out at the end is the answer. Whether the facts of the case outside of McDonnell-Douglas seem to suggest discrimination is rarely discussed. If McDonnell-Douglas says the answer is no discrimination, then that's the outcome that we get from the court. So in the end, as our book shows, we think there are a lot of problematic analytical devices that in the end don't tell us whether discrimination happened or not. Now, what's really interesting about all of these dynamics is they result in very lengthy court opinions where there is lots of facially sort of superficial analysis. If you pick up the opinion, you will think that judges are really wrestling hard with the questions of discrimination. But when I show you the stories, I think that you can see that we're getting some counterintuitive results. So to end, as we look to the future, I hope that some of you will think it's still a worthwhile project to think about first-generation discrimination. It still happens, and I think there is much work, positive work, that can happen in changing the current state of doctrinal discrimination law. Thank you.
All right, so our next presenter will be Professor Bartlett and Gulati, and their piece is Discrimination by Customers.
So I'm gonna stay here. So many activities that society considers harmful, it prohibits both on the buy end and the sell end. That we think about illegal drugs, body organs, bribery, prostitution. We think the activity or the goods are harmful. We prohibit people from selling and buying it. So Mitu and I started our project because we were puzzled by the fact that society thinks that discrimination is wrong, but has chosen to only prohibit it from basically from the sell end. The law of employment discrimination, the law of public accommodations, the anti-discrimination law, is aimed at business activity. It assumes that businesses are the ones who discriminate, and if we can stop businesses from discriminating, then we've stopped discrimination. Yet much of the discrimination we were learning really comes from the hands of customers. And there's a lot of research on it. I'll just give you a couple of the studies that we use just to set up the problem. So customers who rent from Black Airbnb hosts pay on average 12% less than, their properties command 12% less than equivalent valued Airbnb properties owned by non-Black hosts. Customer ratings, all those things you fill out when you rate a transaction, if you've dealt with when it comes to studying the gender of the customer service representative, women are undervalued by about 21%. Some of you may be familiar with Ian Ayer's work, where he showed that Black cab drivers are tipped 1/3 less than non-Black drivers and are 80% more likely to be stiffed. And also, the research in the restaurant industry shows that tips by male wait staff and evaluations are substantially higher than female wait staff, except when the patrons are regulars. Then the women do okay. So that's another paper, and probably a pretty interesting one. Now, there's reason to think that discrimination through sharing platforms like Uber and Airbnb will make customer discrimination, that is, discrimination by customers, easier and more prevalent. And Naomi Schoenberg, some of you may know, has argued that these sites not only facilitate discrimination, but they encourage discrimination because of the greater intimacy and personal sharing that happens in order to build up trust in these transactions. So the puzzle is, why does society prohibit businesses from discriminating but not customers, given that we know it's a problem? And the paper started out by being really just an effort to unpack the rationales that were offered and figure out whether we thought they were sufficient. So there are basically two sets of rationales that we look at. I'm going to do this really quickly. One is efficiency. It's easier to target businesses. We already regulate businesses. We know who they are. They do a lot of transactions with a lot of people. If we can stop them from discriminating, that's just a more efficient use of regulatory resources. And secondly, and the one that we have found people think in the few presentations that we've done on this project that people find even more powerful is the privacy rationale. That is, we think that customers' purchases are private and they should be protected as private individual decisions. So these seem pretty sensible to us as justifications, but the closer we looked at them, the less satisfactory they seemed. And this is where I'm really going to shortcut it, and Mitu may want to say more. We argue that it may be more efficient to regulate businesses than customers, but it's not sufficient. That is, since, just as in other things we don't like, we regulate both ends, we find that there's still continuing discrimination by customers, so to say it's more efficient doesn't mean it's enough to regulate only businesses. As for privacy, which is, as I say, the more seductive rationale, the problem is that it kind of begs the question. Every effort to end discrimination has been met initially with the claim that this is our private decision, not the government's. So it's a question of, it's our right not to associate with black people. It's our right not to send our kids to school with black people. It's our right to hire who we want. These are personal decisions, and these were some very respectable people all along have made these arguments only to eventually have them eroded. So so to us, we share the instinct that this is what we buy and what we shop for is a very personal decision. People shouldn't be supervising those, as we all pretend, of course, that there's someone who doesn't know everything that we buy and shop for. But we don't want the law certainly to have any kind of supervisory role over it. So we share that instinct, but we wonder what separates that instinct from the one that initially stood in the way of non-discrimination legislation. So we thought this was a pretty interesting little tiny essay, but everyone said, you really have to, if you're going to make this kind of claim, you're really going to have to say how you think the law ought to respond to this, if this isn't satisfactory. And I think it's been disappointing, certainly disappointing to us, that we haven't really got a great answer to that yet. We don't yet, and I don't think we're ever going to favor a direct legal prohibition on customer discrimination, really for practical reasons as much as any. I mean, how would you do it? We don't have an answer to the question, how would you do it? And we also think that although the efficiency and the privacy concerns aren't sufficient to ignore customer discrimination, that that these reasons are strong enough to have us think twice about just barreling in with a government law that says thou shalt not discriminate as customers. So we're trying to be moderate about this, and where we are right now, and what we'd kind of like some reaction to, is thinking that if the law is to play a useful role, probably what it's going to have to do is slightly enlarge the responsibilities that businesses already have to a more robust concern about not facilitating or even discouraging discrimination by customers. So we've one of the tricky things here is separating the kinds of discriminations that we might want businesses to block altogether, what kinds of discriminations maybe we should allow but require customers to pay extra for them, so that whatever negative market externalities are caused by that discrimination can be so that a person is paying the victim essentially to discriminate. If you turn down enough drivers in Uber with Muslim-sounding names or pictures, maybe you have to at some point pay more for the service than you otherwise have to pay, that sort of thing. We're thinking about bundling strategies. Duke men's basketball is pretty hot stuff around here. People have to buy a whole season's ticket, even though some of the games are, for schlunkers, sort of, We're playing Yale soon, for example. So the notion is the notion is that there could be more bundling so we imagine if, I haven't tried this on the president yet, but I think I will. He bundled men's and women's basketball tickets so that there would be build up a constituency. People wouldn't have to go to the games, but it would share the cost. It would kind of even out things. People might go because you don't want to waste your money. They go to the Yale game now. They might develop an appetite for women's basketball. There's a huge disparity in the attention given to men's and women's sports, and of course, the coach's pay is astronomically different in most institutions. It certainly is in this one, and so we think this is customer discrimination. Right, customers are preferring male sports to female sports. It has an impact on a negative impact on a differential impact on women. So it sounds like a wild and crazy idea, but we're trying to think of ways of having businesses be more creative to either block the really bad forms of discrimination or like patients who don't want to deal with male nurses. Businesses can just say, no, you don't have a choice about that, or bundling strategies to kind of pass the costs that people can exercise, sort of like we do in managed care. When you want a doctor who's out of network, you can make that choice, but you're going to have to pay for it. It's easier said than done, but we'd love to have ideas in that range. There are, of course, some forms of customer discrimination that we might think were positive. So we don't want a rule that rules out or makes impossible consumer efforts to eliminate discrimination or to remedy past discrimination. So, for example, buy black consumer campaigns, girl cots that are opposed to businesses that advertise using negative body images of women and so on. So this makes this even trickier. We have found that the thing that people get most upset about, and that may help to account why we're on a panel on discrimination in the dating markets, is people always ask, I think all of my friends must use dating sites because they all want to say, well, what about dating sites? Can you, as a customer, can you designate, I want to only look for men, or I only look for women, or I only want to look for whites, or non-whites. And so, we've sort of decided to take that off the table just by saying that there are some forms of discrimination that sort of are, in a way, a shame. We could probably do a lot. If there was more interracial dating, we could probably make more headway in eliminating racism, maybe, I don't know. But that this was just not something that we were going to ever get any traction in, and this is where it really gets personal in terms of people feeling things like sexual desire are going to be very specific, and so even though we're on this panel with that name, we don't. That's not one of the areas that we right now intend to interfere with.
I don't want to. If we're done with time.
Is that 10 minutes?
Yeah, I think it was.
Oops, sorry.
Thank you. Professor Selmi will be our next.
I'm going to go over there. Well, it's a pleasure to be here, and I want to start with a caveat, and that is that I don't belong here. Kind of the story of my life, turns out. This panel is called Discrimination in Dating and Consumer Markets. I'm not talking about either. I don't fit the panel unless you stop the title after the first word. I am talking about discrimination, but I was originally on a different panel that dissolved, and so this will be a slightly different, but it's going to have some similar themes in terms of contemporary discrimination. And what I'm talking about is how we can interpret statistical inequities or inequalities as discrimination. How we know when we see those inequities, and they're everywhere, as I'll mention in a moment, that they're the product of discrimination, and how we can reach conclusion that discrimination is the underlying cause in that. And I think this is important for two different reasons. One is, I think, when it comes to the issue of discrimination, okay. When it comes to the issue of discrimination, I think you can generally divide people into three broad groups. The first is one when you talk about inequities, and let me just give you a couple examples from current data, and that is, when we look at inequities, we see that residential segregation remains about what it was. It's better than it was 20 years ago, but it's not that much better. Schools remain segregated. We have inequities in school discipline, which I'm going to talk about, police stops, which I'm going to talk about, prisons, wealth accumulation. One of the most interesting statistics to me is that the unemployment for African Americans is twice what it is for whites. It's been that way going back to the 1950s when the data was first collected. The response to that is often, well, there's different educational levels. African Americans don't have the same educational achievement as whites. That's partly true, but when you look at the data, the unemployment is twice for African Americans, no matter what the educational level, and that goes back to 1950s as well in that. There's also been lots of recent studies on sort of different, and some of the consumer-oriented, restaurants, but there's also been studies demonstrating discrimination or disparate results by basketball refs who call more fouls on African Americans, or white refs will call more fouls. Umpires, baseball umpires as well. In that, there's also a recent study showing that fewer wiretap applications go to African American judges. In that, just about everywhere you look, you'll find these inequities. But yet, there's great reluctance to attribute these inequities to discrimination. And I think you can broadly divide people up into three different groups when it comes to these inequities. The first group is what I would refer to as the yes, but group. People will acknowledge the inequities, and for the most part, you have to, but they will come up with some alternative explanation. And it's not usually an alternative explanation, it's an alternative theory. But what about, and we'll talk about that in a moment, the second group, and this might be most of the people at this conference, is that discrimination is everywhere, sort of a different group where we are more likely to attribute inequities to discrimination than others. And then there's a third group that will say, tell me more, who will hear the inequities and will see and will be open to conclusions of discrimination in that. And one of the real projects is trying to take the first group, the yes but, and convert them to the tell me more group. I always look at discrimination as kind of on a spectrum, and where you have got on one side old-fashioned discrimination that most everybody would agree is discrimination. On the other side, you have issues that most people would not. There would generally be some sense that it's not discrimination in that. And it's the broad middle group that if you're trying to remedy inequities, that we need to expand. And the question is how we do that. And I think one of the things that's important is when we turn to thinking about remedying discrimination, one of the things that seems central to me is that as a nation, we're generally only committed to remedying discrimination. We're not generally committed to remedying broad inequality. And so having a broad definition of discrimination becomes even more important if we want to try and do something about the inequities, which I think is important for that. And the other issue that I always talk about with respect to discrimination as a preliminary matter is, we often think of it as a thing, as something that people can agree on. But ultimately, discrimination is a legal conclusion when we're talking about law. It's a social consensus or societal consensus when we're talking about broader issues and really trying to have a more expansive approach to discrimination, not one, though, that is steeped in implicit bias, as I'll mention in a moment, but a more expansive discrimination, of intentional discrimination, is a way I think we might be able to gain more traction in trying to address some of the inequities. I'm going to focus on two particular areas in my talk. And what I wanted to do in this paper is come up with two areas where the data were essentially incontrovertible. You just couldn't argue with the results, but people do argue about the underlying reasons for the inequities. And those two areas are school discipline and police stops. And I'm just going to run through some of the data, and this is an area where I apologize for not having PowerPoint, except I would just be saying this one too, this one too, this one too. They all say pretty much the same thing. With respect to school discipline, one of the things that's interesting with both these areas is there is a broad disparity with respect to school suspensions and expulsions with respect to African American children. Generally, African American children are suspended at 3 times the rate of white students. And the thing that is most depressing about this statistic is it goes back to the 1970s. The first report documenting disparities in school discipline was published in 1979 by the Children's Defense Fund, and things have only gotten worse since. Worse in part because schools are now using suspension much more frequently than they used to as a disciplinary tactic in that. And there's all the studies, there's lots of them looking at different jurisdictions, UCLA, Pennsylvania. The Justice Department has a collective one, and one of the things that they show, and this is 2014 data, is that even though black students are 16% of the school population, they're 32% of suspensions, out-of-school suspensions, 31% of student arrests, and another depressing statistic is these disparities start in preschool. The idea that people are being suspended in preschool just seems crazy, but the disparity is even higher in preschool, where African American students represent 48% of the students who are suspended from preschool in that. And this is obviously a counterproductive strategy, because even if these children were troublemakers, removing from school is probably the last thing you want to do. But the disparities persist, and the explanations persist. It's very rare that everyone has to acknowledge the data, because this is very easy data to get. It's conclusive. It's everywhere. There was another study done in southern jurisdictions. There were 82 school districts, none of which was all black school districts. 82 school districts that only suspended African American students, that they didn't suspend one white student among those school districts. So it's hard to deny the data, but it's very hard to get people to agree that this is a product of discrimination. And the first response is almost always, well, these are kids who are acting up and who deserve to be suspended. And then I always pause and say, well, why would we start with that? Why would we assume that African Americans are behaving at such a higher disruptive rate than white students? Why don't we start with the assumption that they're not and that something's wrong with this? And then if we don't, we start with that assumption, we could also look at the actual data, which shows that it's not a product of disparate behavior. And there's lots of studies in this area that instead, most of the suspensions result from discretionary, not mandatory behavior. And those who have observed classes, and there's lots of tapes and stuff of classes, have concluded that African American children are treated differently from white children. There was a very interesting study recently that showed, and this isn't really surprising, but it's interesting that African American students who act up in class are almost always treated in a criminal way. The behavior is criminalized, whereas when white students do, they're given medication. It's treated as ADHD, and there was the study was pretty clear that for the same behavior, the response was quite different. There's also studies showing that African American children are treated as if they're older, much older than white children, and then there's other studies, but there's no particular reason based on the data to assume it's as a result of behavior in the classroom. And then if it were, you could also discuss why students might be acting up, given that they are often treated in a discriminatory way in class, which might produce some disruptive behavior. One of the things I find problematic in this area is that even those who concede that there's a problem are reluctant to see it as discrimination. And if we do see it as discrimination, it's generally people say, well, it's implicit bias at best. It's, the teachers aren't doing anything wrong. And I think that's a mistake. And I think it's particularly a mistake to treat this as implicit bias when you think about principals or whoever is the final decision maker who is seeing only or lots of African American kids come before them and be suspended. There's nothing implicit about that. That's explicit. That's somebody making a decision about the children. And that principal might be doing that as order to have the back of the teachers or to be supportive of the teachers, but it's also important to see that as a choice that the principal is making, not as something that's compelled by behavior or by statute. And that's a principal who's choosing consciously to support the teachers over the students. So I don't think there's any particular reason to see this as a form of implicit bias. When we look at police stops, the data is almost identical. And by police stops, I mean automobile stops rather than stop and frisk, although the stop and frisk data are pretty similar, but a little bit more complicated. And there was a very interesting, it's always hard to call this stuff interesting in that context, but a very interesting trial in New York involving the stop and frisk, and a very lengthy opinion that goes through all the data in a pretty compelling way in that. But when you look at the automobile stops, the data are clear, and here's what they show. African Americans are generally twice as likely to be stopped as whites, regardless of what measure you use, the population in the area, the driving population, or what have you. They are also much more likely, sometimes 4 times as likely, to be searched, sometimes by consensual search, but as I think was talked about this morning, as most of us would understand, it's rare that there's such thing as a consensual search when you're being dealt with a police officer, but they're much more likely to be searched. And their car is more likely to be searched. However, and this is consistent, all the studies show that African Americans are much less likely to be found with contraband. Whites are always high, have a higher rate of what's called a hit rate with respect to contraband in terms of weapons or drugs and the like. And study after study shows this. And this data goes back to the 1990s. In that. And the studies, gosh, you can just run them down. Connecticut, Rhode Island, New Jersey, Massachusetts, Maryland, Illinois, North Carolina, including Durham, where there's one police officer who stopped like 3,000 people in a year compared to most officers who stopped 200. And that, so those of you, at least the African Americans, you want to avoid that police officer in that. There was just a New York Times article. They didn't mention his name, but it's Durham. New York Times just did a lengthy story on Greensboro, and they also looked at 14 different jurisdictions that had studies, and they calculated the rate African Americans were more likely to be stopped. There was not a single jurisdiction where African Americans had the same likelihood as being stopped as whites. The best rate was North Carolina State Police, and it was 1.5 times as likely in that. And there was an interesting, in Missouri has been keeping data since 2000 in that. And the Attorney General in a recent press conference noted that since they've been keeping data, the disparities had increased substantially. And you could just see the exasperation in his face. Even Nebraska had racial disparities. It's not even clear how they're finding African Americans to stop in Nebraska, right? It's 5% of the population, but they must be finding them all in that. And there's one study done by the RAND Corporation which found in Oakland, which is a very multiracial progressive city, there was not a disparity. But every other study shows disparities, but there's still a reluctance to conclude that these are the product of discrimination in that. And they've tried lots of different arguments come up. Well, it's, yes, you're basing it on the population in the area, but the driving population might be different. That's the most common. So many studies have looked at the actual driving population. There was actually an interesting study recently based on red light, cameras. To see if the population was different, and also to see if African Americans drove differently with cameras. And they found it's actually a very interesting study, very poorly written up. But they found that there was not any difference in behavior, and they also were able to determine the race of the drivers pretty easily in terms of license plates and the like. And that explanation has been refuted consistently. There was a detailed regression analysis done for the Los Angeles Police Department. And most of these are based on data that the law requires requires the jurisdictions to produce. And that analysis showed that you couldn't explain the disparity based on the high crime rates, the driving population, economic factors. They ruled out all of those. And then the police department said, well, that's old data, even though it was the most recent data that the police department had released in that. And nobody seems to take credit, or credit. might be the right term, nobody seems to be willing to acknowledge that these stops are likely to be the product of discrimination and that they really don't do much about crime fighting. They're very low, very inefficient method of crime fighting. So my time is running out, or has run out. So let me just mention a couple of things in terms of trying to figure out a way to reach consensus on discrimination. As I mentioned, I think it's a mistake to treat these issues as implicit bias, because I think the problem with implicit bias is that it's everywhere. And it's kind of a trump card for plaintiffs. And when plaintiffs have tried to use implicit bias studies in court, judges have rejected it because the plaintiffs basically would always win. Because the idea is, well, we're going to tell you that implicit bias is present in people, and these results are the product of implicit bias. And there's really no response to that in that. It's too broad, and it's also not clear what the remedy is for that. And it also takes responsibility away from people when we start talking about the unconscious. It's been a very interesting, it works outside of litigation better, but not great, because all these police departments have also been trained with respect to implicit bias, and they still reject it. I think we're better off by trying to treat and make it clear that these are examples of intentional discrimination, at least by the ultimate decision maker. For that police officer who stops 3,000 people in Durham and doesn't get disciplined, that nobody takes offense, it's the person who doesn't step up on that who should be found guilty of intentional discrimination, intentionally choosing not to act on data that is very clear in that. The standards that we have when we're looking at statistical inequities, you know, the social science standards of 2 standard deviation, 95% confidence level, is probably the right standard to use as long as we're using statistical methods. But we shouldn't require parties to rule out every possible alternative explanation. In fact, there's an old Supreme Court case, Bazemore from North Carolina, where the Supreme Court even said that back in the 1980s, that we should be more willing to accept conclusions of discrimination. But we have a tremendous reluctance to conclude that there's discrimination. And I think what we know about remedying discrimination is it really does require people to step up. Litigation is probably not the way to do it. And one of the things that I think, you know, I've been thinking about the last few days is all these conflicts that are occurring on campuses, and how so many people sat silently while so much was going on, and how things have escalated as a result of that. Now students have taken things into their own hands, but most of us could have done better on that. And I think that's what's important too, to make this so school principals need to be held accountable for the suspensions. The school district needs to be held accountable for suspensions. That needs to become an issue when you're hiring superintendents and the like. Parents need to step up when they see those inequities in that. Because what we know is that when people are held accountable, we know this from workplace studies, we know this was actually in the umpire study. So umpires are more likely to call strikes against people who are not their same race. But when it's on national TV, they're much more likely to follow the real strike zone. In that when they're being watched, when they're being held accountable, we know that's a way to reduce disparity. And we also know that there, you know, people can make difference. The new mayor of New York, when he came into New York, you know, Mayor Bloomberg was terrible on the stop and frisk. He fought that. He testified. He had all this terrible public testimony, and the new mayor of New York came in and said, we're stopping that, and we're settling the litigation. And what we have to look at is we have to convince people that these are acts that are problematic and discriminatory. We need to think about it as a local level, not a national level, not the federal government, at local level, and people need to be held accountable for these disparities.
And Professor Banks.
Well, thank you. This was, I mean, this entire day has been a treat, and this panel in particular is a treat. I guess I should take responsibility for the word dating being in the description of this panel, because that's what I'm going to talk about. I thought I was the outlier for that reason. So this is drawn on from a book that I did a few years ago, and the topic is for today is really dating or sort of dating discrimination, relationship discrimination, which is in many ways very different from discrimination in these other sectors. In other settings, people don't want to admit that they discriminate because it's illegal, right? If you're a business owner to discriminate, or if you're a law enforcement officer. I've talked to a lot of cops, and I don't know that I've ever heard one admit that they discriminate. You would think that they're literally race blind. So they have no, they don't want to take liability, so they don't admit that they discriminate. Where in this area, of course, there's no legal liability. And so people are very open about taking race into account in all sorts of ways when it comes to their intimate lives. Whether they're using an online dating site, which most people do, they don't do that when they're in school because you have so many great peers around you. But once they get out of school, that becomes quite common. Or if they're just talking about, who to approach or who they want to approach them, who parents want their children to meet, who grandmothers want their children to meet. People talk about race, and they admit that race is relevant. So it's very different from other markets in some ways, but it's also very similar to other markets in some ways. And that's one reason I think it's interesting to think about discrimination in the dating context, is because we might learn something about how discrimination operates generally. In particular, something about all the different species or varieties of discrimination that travel under that term, discrimination. Okay, so this story begins with the decline in marriage. Marriage has declined substantially over the last half century. That decline has been society-wide, but it's been most extreme for African Americans. Roughly, it's fair to say African Americans are an outlier when we talk about the decline in marriage. I should also note here that although I use the term marriage and will continue to use the term marriage, marriage is really just a placeholder. Really what we're talking about is just stable, committed, ongoing relationships. And when you look at stable, committed, ongoing, long-term relationships, African Americans are much less likely by a wide margin than other groups to be in such relationships. Right. One marker of that is the percentage of children who are raised with one parent rather than both parents. Society-wide, about 30% of children are born to unmarried parents. For African Americans, it's more like 70%. And sometimes those couples live together when the children are born, but typically those relationships dissolve within a few years. So these are some concerning developments. So one question is why? Why has marriage declined so much for African Americans? It's not really about slavery. It's not about things that happened way, way back in the past, because up through the mid-20th century, marriage rates were more or less the same between African Americans and other groups. But during the 70s and after, we had two troubling developments. One troubling development was we could talk to three troubling developments. One of which I'm going to say is pivotal to both. One is the underlying. The underlying development is the deindustrialization, decline of smokestack industries, the economic changes that in places where I'm from in Cleveland just changed the employment landscape for black men. Black men who had jobs that allowed them to support families, buy homes in 1950. By 1980, those jobs were disappearing. I have a cousin, in fact, one of my favorite cousins. Actually, he will say he is my favorite. Actually, he is one of my favorite cousins. But he was a steel worker, and he actually made a shift. He went from being a steel worker to being a nurse because he saw what was happening at his steel mill. But most of his coworkers did not do that. Right. Most of his coworkers went down a path that was not nearly as productive as his path. So we have this deindustrialization, and then after deindustrialization begins, we have the rise in incarceration, right? Facts that everyone has probably heard and will hear at this event more than once. We incarcerate more people than any other nation in the world, black men in particular. Are extraordinarily likely to spend time in jail or be under the control of the criminal justice system. That in turn makes them unable to obtain good employment, so they're much more likely to be unemployed, and they also, black men have also fallen behind in school. So at the bottom end of the market, at the socioeconomically, we have lots of black men with less education who are unemployed, likely to have a criminal record, are not able to be productive members of society. And then at the upper end, we don't have many black men. The gender disparity in graduation for African Americans has grown over the last few decades. It's now at about 2 to 1. Which is to say that 2 black women graduate college for every black man every year. We even see in fields that are typically dominated by men, like computer science, there are actually more black women computer scientists in our nation than there are black men computer scientists. These are not, it's good for black women, as I have 3 sisters, good for black women to do well, but it's not good for black men to fall so far behind, and this does have consequences for the marriage market. So we have these developments, and then when this happens, you might expect that you would find more black women marrying men of other races because there are fewer sort of black men in their pool who are attractive partners for them. But in fact, we don't find that. Black women are the least likely of any minority group to marry someone of another race. Black men, in fact, marry outside the group at 2 to 3 times the rate of black women. These are pretty stark numbers. What black women do is they tend to marry men who are either not as educated, not as high earning as they are, or both. And these are not small differences. These are substantial differences in education and social status in many black couples. We also have large numbers of black women who actually never marry. Typically, people associate the decline in marriage with the underclass or with working class people. But if you look at college-educated black women, they're 2 to 3 times as likely as their white counterparts never to marry or to never have children, which is a pretty stark statistic. There might be some role of preferences in here, but it certainly isn't the whole story. So what is the story? Why do we see black women not intermarrying across racial lines more? Part of the story is clearly that white men and other non-black men have preferences in which black women are not their preferred partner. Right? So that's an essential part of the story. In other words, we still do have a status hierarchy in the society. People are not colorblind. There is a white standard of beauty that white men in particular enact in their lives. So this is a rebuke to anyone who suggests that society is colorblind. There's studies of internet, lots of studies of internet dating now. Those studies pretty consistently find that black women are least likely to be responded to, even when they send an email to someone or send a message to someone. But the preferences of non-black men is not the entire story, because, well, for one thing, while most black women marry black men, a little noticed fact is that black men actually discriminate too. That is, black men discriminate against black women. In the very same studies that show that white men, say, are less likely to respond to black women, they also show that black men are less likely to respond to black women. In fact, they show that the rates of black men responding to black women are sometimes or even often lower than the rates at which other non-black groups respond to black women. Right? So again, this is a story we can think about in the background. How does this mean about discrimination generally? And so the idea there is that, well, actually, white standard of beauty is a real thing, but it's enacted by black people within their relationships as well. It's not simply something that operates across group lines. It also operates within group lines. And complexion as well, which is something that black men in particular pay attention to, shall we say. And there's a hierarchy there as well, right? Those preferences are not idiosyncratic. Okay, so in a way, this deepens the study then. This deepens the puzzle. Why don't we find more intermarriage among black women? Partly it's discrimination by white men and other non-black men, but there's also discrimination by black women, right? Or let's just say maybe the market doesn't operate, right? Some of these we might describe as kind of failures in the market. which are consequences of segregation in our society and the fact that we still have a racially divided society. Right? So one problem is that, as anyone who's ever been in a relationship knows, there are lots of cues that have to go back and forth, lots of subtle communications. I can still remember when I was in high school, my friends and I would spend a lot of time on one side of the room, looking at the girl on the other side of the room and trying to figure out, who should ask her to dance and who she's interested in and how do you know? And it's like, does she look this way? Does she smile? Oh no, So, and when you put race into it, sometimes those cues don't get worked out. There are miscommunications. Many more situations where someone might say, oh, I didn't think he was interested. I didn't know that was a cue. I didn't know that this was so you lose that. And then you also lose the sort of intermediaries, the friend in school that you can let know, let this friend know to let the other friend know that there might be interest there, right? In a racially divided society, right, with African Americans being the most racially divided, frankly. In a racially divided society, those intermediaries are not able to function as well, right? You don't have the brokers to convey the market information. So relationships don't come together, even if, in fact, people might have wanted the relationships to come together, right? One of the key facts about relationships is that, actually, this is probably the key fact. Just remember, we tend to like people who like us. Thank you. Got to hear that again. Yes. Okay. we tend to like people who like us. Conversely, we think people don't like us. We're not showing them a lot of love, right? So that's just how these things work. So when you have a breakdown in communication, relationships don't form when they otherwise might form, right? So we have all those sort of miscommunication, misalignment of preferences, all of that. One other fact, I'm just going to say a couple because I know we're running a little bit late. So we also have. So there are two other factors I want to highlight. So one is just sort of fear and anxiety. I think we still are in a society where, and again, I think we see this with the Black divide the most, right? We have fear and anxieties about crossing color lines. In particular, lots of Black women, this is based somewhat on my interviewing large numbers of people and also review of all the secondary literature, large numbers of Black women wonder, will he understand me? Sometimes it's about big things, sometimes it's about little things like the hair, and things that happen and things that people don't, not public stuff, but private stuff, right? There's anxiety about will he understand, will he accept me, will his family accept me? There are worries about children, right? I know how to raise these type of children, but because these other children, I don't know. It's just there are worries about children. This is from Black women, right? Worried about what would it mean for me to raise a biracial child? Not sure how I would do that. So there are all those sort of anxieties and worries. But then on the other side, there are also social pressures. And I'll just say these are sort of patriarchal set of assumptions, which is distressingly pervasive. By that I mean that lots of Black women feel, especially when Black men are faring so poorly, that it is their job, their responsibility to maintain the Black family, perpetuate the culture, not abandon brothers who need them when they need them most. And that's a sense that individual people will express, but it's also a sense that is socially created through media, through magazines, through books, through what brothers say and fathers say and parents say, through all the social pressures that family and community members can put on people. And just historically, right, backdrop is that one of the big reasons interracial marriage was so low, put it aside legal restrictions, right? And once we get beyond the legal restrictions, one of the big pressures that keeps rates of not only interracial marriages, but gay and lesbian marriages, all of that, one of the big issues, one of the big factors that has kept them so low is social pressure from third parties, right? I have a colleague in the sociology department who's done research showing that, if you really want to increase these sort of, quote, non-normative or non-conventional or non-orthodox couplings, best thing to do is to actually get people away from their family. Because once you get them away from their family, they can do things that they want to do rather than things that are predicated on keeping someone happy. So when you go visit and all that sort of stuff. So we have those pressures that Black women feel. Part of that is an obligation to Black men, which of course is enforced by Black men. We could see this as just a matter of norms and values, but I see it really as a form of coercion. A form of coercion that keeps Black women from embracing the same sort of freedom to make the choices that are best for them that we should want everyone to have. So that's the story, and it's a sad story, but it's a good news story too. The sad story is that the saddest part of this story, I think, is that, or actually most puzzling. The puzzling part of the story is the extent to which so many Black women even are complicit in this process. They're complicit in the process. Even women who would otherwise be, strong, independent, feminist, all of that, complicit in the process. And part of that is just to talk about these issues, frankly, is to, this was not written down, but I'll say it anyway, is actually to open the door on what, for Black people, is a reservoir of shame, I think, and reservoirs of insecurity about family, relationships, intimacy. And partly, that comes from history, and it also is a reaction to what is a legitimate fear. That there are lots of people out there who want nothing more than to be able to say the Black family is deficient, or here's a problem, there's some sort of inherent deficiency in Black people, right? And Black women, perhaps more than anyone, are on guard to not open themselves to that possibility. So that's sadness. That's what makes me sad. What makes me feel good about this, frankly, is that I think this is changing, and it's going to flip pretty quickly. Just 10 years ago, people told me it was implausible that we would have people did tell me it was implausible that we would have a mayor of our nation's largest city who's white and who's married to a Black woman. Not only a Black woman, but a dark-skinned Black woman. That was when de Blasio was just a local politician. And in fact, people did raise the fact that he was married to a Black woman when he was running for one of those local offices, and it was a controversial thing, right? But he managed to get by that and get elected. Now, it seems that this is just going to become the new normal. Another factor that I love, that I think is going to change things too, is that goes by the name of Shonda Rhimes, who just keeps creating all these wonderful, interesting shows. Which cast Black women as strong and also as desirable. So desirable, in fact, that they can be desired by the most powerful men in the world, right? And I think that is a good development. I don't think that public imagery and media can just change things magically, but we do need to change the dialogue so that Black women have the same sort of freedom and feel the same sort of permission to make choices that men have always felt.
All right, so because we started a little late with your forbearance, we're going to take a few questions and run a little bit into the break time, maybe one or two. So.
I was wondering, based on Professor Bartlett and Mr. Gulati's research, have y'all thought about eliminating tipping as a solution? One of the solutions to consider. I mean, there's a lot of other reasons to eliminate tipping. Due to economical concerns that restaurants should be paying their employees minimum wage. It shouldn't be based on whether their restaurant's busy or not, which the employees have no control over. But people are using tipping as a way to evaluate service. But if we're giving them this control, they're going to use it in a discriminatory way. Why don't we just suggest that as a...
So, some employers use tip pooling rather than eliminating tipping. Certainly for big parties where the cost is high, we see this already, people incorporate it. But I like your question in part because I was talking just last night to a cousin of mine who runs a restaurant in London, and they have a policy of imposing a fixed charge. It's a very fancy restaurant, but he has moved I'm ashamed to say this in some ways, he used to have at his Indian restaurant a lot of Indian servers. And they found over time that if you had attractive white servers, you got much bigger tips. And so my Indian cousin, who is one of the most famous Indian chefs in the world, has largely eliminated the Indian servers in favor of very attractive, usually Eastern European, male and female servers. So it was not the tipping, it was just, the tip pooling wasn't really working. But tipping is one of those areas where customer discrimination is just, it's so clear and so pervasive. So in Las Vegas, they
Also
do.
easier to fix.
Yeah, easier to. Las Vegas, they do a lot of this. But you see, when we were studying the casinos in Las Vegas, you see the tip pooling, but the staff segregate themselves. So you see the more attractive servers, they all get together and they get the more favorable shifts, and the less attractive servers. And you see this breakdown by race as well, because again, the racial disparities in who will tip in the Las Vegas casinos are quite extreme. So they have tip pooling, but it doesn't fix the problem.
All right, let's take one more.
Yes, hello. First, to Professor Gulati. That was also a plot point on the show, Fresh Off the Boat, where the the Chinese American dad did the same thing. He hired a white host for their restaurant. I just had to point that out.
No, but you see this. You can see this in the transition of restaurants. When you go from being the local ethnic restaurant to the restaurant where the white people come to eat, right? And that's for a restaurant owners, that's a big transition that, you're getting a better class of people to come eat, but then you start firing your ethnic servers.
For Professor Selmi, because I wanted to ask you, one of the things, and it came up in another session today, one of the things that's really been striking to me as we talk about discrimination and the way we process it is the reluctance to see certain things. For instance, the incident that happened at Spring Valley High School in South Carolina when the young black girl is body slammed against that desk, and you see this very divergent interpretation of what should be an objectively, way of looking at something as objectively horrific, but it gets filtered through all these different lenses. And so based on your presentation, I just wanted to know, how do we reconcile one definition of discrimination with the fact that we're not all looking at this information the same way? Some of us are looking at it and are horrified, and others are looking at it and are saying, you know what, that's just the way it is.
Yeah, all this studies, there's lots of studies showing that people's perspective varies based on their race and backgrounds in that. And to me, there is just this great reluctance by so many people to attribute behavior to discrimination, and it's a very hard thing to move. One of the great ironies is that the election of President Obama gave a lot of folks another excuse for why there's no discrimination, right? Now, it's still a better thing on the whole to have him elected, but there's also been studies to show more recently that people say, well, if we have an African-American president, how can there be discrimination? And it's just, what I think, though, is all of this focus on implicit bias and that people don't mean it and stuff is kind of the wrong focus, because that takes the pressure off people in a way that's not what we intend in that. But the only way you're going to get people to, I think, address their behavior is to make it clear that they're acting in an intentional and discriminatory way. That's why, when the teacher sends a dozen African-American kids to be suspended, and she says, well, it's not like I'm choosing black students. You say, no, that's exactly what you're doing, and it's got to stop. When the police officers say, well, we pull over people, but we don't know their race, and then they search them, you say, well, did you know their race when you searched them? That's intentional. That's not unconscious. And when you're doing, the fact that we've been keeping this, there's one of the Nebraska police chiefs said, we've been keeping this data a long time. I don't know why we're keeping it because nothing changes. He was saying we should stop keeping it. But the question is, well, why have police departments not changed their behaviors? Same with the stop and frisk. There's very little evidence to show that stop and frisk is an effective police tool, but it's a very common police tool and results in the harassment of millions of African Americans and Latinos. They're not usually arrested, but it is a harassment that we could do without, and it's not that hard to change it. But it's trying to figure out how we move that that spectrum so that we see more discrimination. I think the general desire by society is to see less discrimination. I think that's been true for a long time. It's easier. Somebody was talking about social dominance theory. That's part of it. There's also this system justification theory. People want to believe that our world is discrimination-free, that we live in an equal world, that we succeed in our merits. And there's lots of reasons for people to believe that. But we need to sort of find a way to move the dial some.
With that, I'm going to have to call time.
Oh, Darrell, can I ask Rick one question?
Okay.
One small little question. So, Rick, it's so cool. We were in first-year contracts together. It's just so cool we're on the same panel 20 years later. But, so what's the...
law school when we were like 12.
What's the conclusion? So would you say, as we are too wimpy to say, that we should regulate the dating market and we should say, no discrimination? We should say people should have expanded choice.
No.
More choices.
No.
More choices is better for society.
No.
Why not? Isn't that the natural extension of your argument? How else are we going to get there? You didn't give us a solution.
Well, I guess what I would say about, actually about all of our, well, not your study, but the, the policing and the school discipline and consumer markets and in the relationship market is that the, category of discrimination is a cover for myriad different practices, right, that are just very different. And some of those actually that are, identity conscious, race conscious, whatever, we actually think are okay, or should think are okay, right, and should want, and should like. And then others we might think are not okay. And then others we might not think are not okay, but we actually can't eliminate them. So, one of the things that I think is interesting about this project, because people do talk so openly about discrimination in intimate relationships, is that you can think about, discriminate. You can just keep in mind that discrimination is not a unitary concept. It's actually like 10 different subcategories underneath there. And those 10 different categories might have, even if it's an area where we will regulate, they might be appropriate to different legal treatment. Right? And in the area where we don't regulate, like relationships, they might be appropriate to different moral treatment, right? So you can still bring social censure or moral disapproval based on some types of decision making, but maybe not based on other types of decision making, even though they all might rely on race in some way, right? So that's just my take on it. And I think this is again, I think it's actually valuable that the relationship area is not something we would want to regulate, because it does create a freedom in practice, but also a freedom for people to talk, which, can be the first response, right, to anyone who says society is colorblind, right? Because it's so obvious, it seems to me, and almost just, you can't controvert it, that, just as people use race in dating in part as a proxy, for other characteristics, and it's like, how can it not be the case that they use race as a proxy when it comes to policing, or when it comes to employment, or when it comes to some other setting? Because race it actually is related to things out in the world, and people are aware of that. They don't want to admit it in these other settings. But when you talk about personal relationships, they admit it, which is kind of cool, because we can hopefully have a better conversation about how race matters in society. Thank you.